Hello, welcome back to this video. And today this is going to be a special one. I'm not going to be covering one particular bias and in isolation. This is what I've been doing so far, but today I'm going to do, and hopefully from time to time I will do the same. I will get some biases and I will see how they interact with other biases for an outcome. And today is going to be one of these such videos, and I'm going to be covering the subject of ad hominem and straw manning. And I decided to title this ad hominem and straw manning when character is at play, because unfortunately this is used to attack a person, and especially a person's character. Now, I always like to start with a point of reference, and sometimes that point of reference is going to be a definition. Sometimes it's going to be looking from the lens of psychology, and sometimes it's going to be paying attention from an anthropological point of view. And this is going to be an example of the latter. In fact, I'm going to start with the concept of self-preservation and how self-preservation makes us look for protection. So as I've explained already in the past, the very same idea behind heuristics is to identify what things are potentially dangerous from us from the things that are potentially good for us. But I always say that this is not a balanced system. This is not 50-50. I'm going to be focused on the positive one, and 50, I'm going to be focused on the negative. In fact, we have our tendencies to focus more on the negative one, because that is also helping our survival by focusing on the negative and try to avoid just that. So when we talk about protection, we talk about protection from not only other species, but also from other people. Remember that, yes, in the beginning, probably our main concern was weather, finding food, and protecting ourselves against other animals. But the moment that we start to gather with each other, form tribes, now our main concern was not only, again, ourselves from that point of survival against animals, but also how to defend ourselves against other tribes. So that's why the protection from other species and protection from other people, you start to develop that concept of your group and what the others are, meaning you are in part of a group, and that is your group, and the others are the other groups. And that is the beginning of what we call the in-group bias. So today, we're not going to go in depth into in-group bias, but I'm going to define these very simply. Basically, in-group bias is when you adopt the biases and the behaviors and the concepts from a group, substituting part of your individual's behaviors and beliefs. Now, feeling safe is essential to our well-being. That's why a lot of our early development was created or formed just to look for safety, not only safety from the weather, but also safety from the environment and others. And that meant more often than not to look for people who could protect us, or with whom we could gather around and we could distribute certain tasks to make our lives a little bit easier. Now, sometimes, as I said before, we have the tendency to always go to that extreme, to thinking that everything is compared to death and try to avoid death. But I said before, it's not only about avoiding death, it's also about avoiding the loss of quality of life. On the other hand, we have the other extreme, and this is the positive one. As I said before, the negative being the one in which you are trying to avoid death or a substantial loss of quality of life. That's why you're looking for a tribe. But in the positive side is that if you find one and then you're comfortable, you're going to have enormous advantages. Why? Because if you feel safe and making other people feel safe, among other things, there's going to be a boost in your attractiveness, especially if you make other people feel safe. You will get more power within your tribe or within your group. And there's also more security. You increase your security in yourself. And by doing that, you're also becoming more confident. And by doing that, you're giving confidence to other people. So as you can see, this is not a very balanced system. This is also a very unbalanced mechanism, that there are two extremes that basically shape your behavior to try to find a tribe that makes you feel safe. And a lot of our behavior is also conditioned to stay in that tribe. We have already discussed that in the confirmation bias subject that we covered in the video. Now, these two extremes condition, again, the way that we perceive others and relate to them. Why? Because if now we're looking for security, for safety, we're looking for a way for us to increase our chance of survival and not dying, we're going to select the people who makes us feel that way. And as I always explain, we have to be careful with this, and we have to redefine this. I always say makes us feel, and I never say gives us that, because this is not about reality. This is just about our perception of reality. So again, our behavior is conditioned to find the people who makes us feel safe, and also we're trying to feel safe, but we're not looking for safety. Well, yes, we are, but we're not actually looking for objectively finding safety. We're looking for things that we believe will give us safety. All right, so this is actually leading me towards the next point that I was going to make, and this is our relationship with others. So, as I was explaining before, this is kind of like suggesting that there's some confirmation bias in the sense of we are trying to select people that side with us. And confirmation bias makes us choose certain people and discard others based on our beliefs. And unfortunately, we tend to think about confirmation bias, about pre selecting information rather than seeing the whole picture, meaning we also tend to select or pre-select people because of our beliefs, because it will match what we believe, it will give us that sense of security, and that's why sometimes our behavior is just to try to find the people who find the same things as we do. They have the same behaviors, they're like-minded, they have even the same religions, because again, it gives us that sense of security. Now, the second point is going to be a little bit less clear, and it kind of might seem that this is a contradiction from the first point, but bear with me because it will make sense in a second. Now, our beliefs will adjust according to the group's beliefs, in group bias, or worse, our perception of our group's beliefs. I'm going to stop that for a second. I'm going to explain what I mean by that. So, once we again enjoy being part of the group, we have all the benefits. A lot of our behaviors is going to try to maintain that level of safety that we're enjoying, and then we're trying to again look for ways in which we can feel better and also make sure that we are not expelled from that group, because unfortunately in the past that used to mean death. In fact, there's a form of punishment in, I think, ancient that was called ostracio, and that was, sometimes you have heard the word ostracism, and that would mean literally being expelled not only from the tribe but from the city, and you would have to live outside, and then more often than not you would not only experience a detrimental loss of quality of life, but you would also die. Now, that's one of the reasons why, again, a lot of our behaviors were developed just precisely to stay as part of the group. And sometimes that even meant to get some of the beliefs that you haven't thought through, meaning if there is anything that you haven't thought through because you're not mature enough, or because you never have thought of that thing in particular, and now you see a group of people who already have a belief form about that subject that you haven't thought through, our tendency is to actually adopt the behavior and the belief of that group because we don't have anything, and it's easier for us to just have that belief, and we even replicate the same behavior and the same belief and even try to convince other people. And that is a subtle change because, again, this is based on you not having a belief about something in particular, and then other people telling you what they believe, and you just adjusting and adopting that. But sometimes it's even more aggressive. Our pressure to be part of the group is so high because there's so many benefits that sometimes what we tend to do is we even agree with something that we internally disagree with, meaning we change beliefs that we had based in our perception of what the group thinks. So sometimes you're going to see that, especially in politics, you're going to see that even in sports, when you side in one side and when you take a side and then you believe certain things for certain years, and then all of a sudden you exhibit a completely opposite behavior, and you're going to be looking for things to justify that behavior. So again, that is because your pressure to be part of the group is so much higher than your beliefs that sometimes you're willing to overlook the fact that you are discarding a belief that you had and then going for a different, totally opposite belief. So this is the beginning of what we know as the groupthink bias. In this case, we adjust and adapt the beliefs of the group, and that is called the groupthink. And sometimes that carries some biases, and that's what is called the groupthink bias. Take it to an extreme, the individual substitutes its beliefs for the beliefs of the group, which is, again, the groupthink bias. And again, take it to an extreme, that is called a radicalization. But talking about radicalization, we actually have a misconception about the concept of radicalization. Because our perception of radicalized people, it's it tends to be very extreme. It tends to be like something that is so outrageous, and normally is the other extreme. It's never us. It's never the people that we defend. It's never our politicians. It's never not. It's never our sports team. It's always the other ones that are extreme. Now, I put here some examples of terrorism and hooligans. Now, why did I say that? Because terrorism is looked obviously in many different ways depending on the side that you are in. I'm not justifying, I'm just saying that the reality is, for example, I'm going to name one example. In Spain, there was a terrorist group called ETA, in which they used to put bombs to people who were part of the government or people who were associated of part of the government, and they would kill them. Now, obviously, for most Spaniards, that was seen as an act of terrorism and was perceived as a negative. However, the people who were part of the group obviously saw that as a justification for the oppression that they were being subjected in that region of Spain. Now, those are two opposite views under the same exact fact. Now, in the case of the hooligans, I don't know if you're know if you're familiar with that phenomenon, but especially in football, soccer, for you, the people who are the fans of the group. Sometimes there's an extreme group of fans of each soccer team that will create a lot of problems, and it's always the other team's hooligans. That's the name. That would be the bad ones. Never is my team that is the bad ones. So again, this actually happens a lot. And this is actually called the blind spot bias. And I'm going to talk about the blind spot bias. And again, by the way, if you don't understand some of these words, like, for example, blind spot bias or the case that we were discussing before about the groupthink bias, don't worry. I'm going to dedicate an entire section of this. I'm going to dedicate each video, a different video to each of them. But just so you know, blind spot bias is kind of very simple to understand, is when we don't perceive our biases the same way that we perceive others. In fact, we're not even aware of our own biases, and that is a blind spot bias. Now, all right, so this concept of radicalization that I was discussing is a phenomenon, but sometimes, as I said, we confuse that with how we perceive some people as radical. So there's some objective radicalization, and there's some things that we tend to look as radicalized or radical people, depending on which side are we on the subject. So if we are on one side, we look at the others as a more radical, even when they're not. So that's what sometimes triggers this following behavior, which is the demonizing the other, because we perceive them as not only bad, but as extremists and dangerous to us and people who are like us. Now, things at play. Well, we tend not to see others the same way that we see ourselves. This is part of the blind spot bias that I was saying, but also part of the blind spot bias is that we tend to see other people's problems as not that bad as we are. Like, we have it worse. Like, whatever it is that they are facing is nothing compared to what we're going through. So again, this is a blind spot bias. There are other biases that makes us believe that, but we will discuss that in the future. But again, taking this behavior to an extreme, it makes us look at others as mean, bad people who complain too much. You probably are familiar with that because sometimes it's been said to you, and sometimes you said that to other people and talk about other people. Now, we don't tend to see what we do as bad. We tend to see what we do as always good and fair. Not always, but we're not actually very fair with how we behave. And this is also a different type of bias. Again, we're going to dedicate a different a different video to this. This is called reaffirmation bias. And I know that it might seem like confirmation bias, but this is slightly different because in this case, we tend to reaffirm our behaviors by saying we are good. We are the people who are correct. We tend to see things the way that we perceive because obviously that gives us not only the sense of security, we also are exposed to people who are like us, and especially now with the social media, it's actually even much harder to not see that behavior. So then we create that sense of persona and what good people are and what bad people are, and we are always obviously in the good category. So again, this is an example of reaffirmation bias. Now, let's talk about the ad hominem fallacy first. Now, The ad hominem fallacy, ad hominem is literally ad, a person. It's a Latin phrase. It means at a person. It actually means at a man. So it's basically an attack done to a person's character. And the justification for that is it is okay for me to attack that person or a person's character, especially if I perceive that that person is bad and my attacks are justified. As I said before, the problem with all of this is that we tend to see people as more radicalized than they really are, especially when people are not part of our group. If we are looking or talking about other people who are part of our group, then we tend to look at them as not as bad. What he did, it was because of A, B, and C. You tend to justify that or tend to justify that behavior. But the moment that a person from the other group does something similar, you tend to look for ways in which you can demonize the person because he's not part or she's not part of your group. Now, again, it is okay for me to attack that person's character because I perceive that person as bad and my attack is justified. And we also have this feeling that that person won't suffer that much, that our behavior, our words, our post complaining about this person, that will not have such an effect on that person. In fact, if that person complains, that person is being a baby, that person is being triggered, and we're even going to justify our behavior by even saying, you see, I insulted that person, and that person couldn't even take it. That means that that person is even worse than I thought. So there's also one other justification that sometimes we use, and that is, especially when we're talking about people who we perceive as being wealthy, and we tend to see they have money, so what I'm doing will not have an effect on them, or they can buy their way out. We have that feeling of, especially when that scandal has happened to a celebrity, we don't think, oh, that person has enough, let's not pile on top of that. We think, well, whatever, like that person has a lot of money, he's going to be fine or she's going to be fine. And that is what I call, and I'm sorry to do this because this is a long phrase, the rich people can buy their happiness while poor people have to suffer the consequences fallacy. And yes, a totally made up phrase, but it serves a purpose, right? So we tend to see, again, rich people, especially when we are not rich, as the others, and we tend to see them as people who do mean things, that they complain too much, that they don't suffer the same way that we do. And probably it is true. Obviously, I'm not going to deny the fact that having some money or more money will give you more advantages than having not no money or having very little money. Obviously, that is true, but at the same time, we tend to oversimplify that and equating that with happiness. Now, it doesn't seem fair. It doesn't seem fair that that person has so much money, that has more opportunities. And you might think, well, if I had that money, I would be able to get over that. So I don't understand why that person is not capable of doing that. Not understanding that that person might not be able to have the skills to do it, the capacity to do it, or even have people around them who can support them. So ad hominem attacks, and now I'm going to address the ad hominem attacks. The problem with them is that they don't address any argument. In fact, it's not an argument at all. You're attacking a person's character. It does not solve any problem, and it just distracts people. It makes the people who side with you agree even more with you, and the people who disagree with you even disagree more. So it only is a boost for your ego. I mean, if you're the one saying the ad hominem or creating the ad hominem statement, it only boosts. It's a boost of for the ego of the person who makes the argument and the people who follow them. So again, if you're talking about rich people and you're talking about one particular person that did something that you deem inappropriate, you think is very bad or whatever it is, and you think that it's okay for you to attack because that person, deserves that. Um, Obviously you will have people who side with you, and you would talk to each other, and then you would feel that there's something that you did that it was right, that that those things need to be said, or that person deserves the attacks that he's receiving or she's receiving, not understanding that that person again might not have the skills necessary to deal with the problem, the people around him or her to deal with the problem, etc. So again, this doesn't solve anything at all. It's just an attack that doesn't address any argument. It's not an argument in itself. It does not solve any problem at all. It just forms a distraction for the real nitty gritty of what you're probably trying to achieve. It makes, again, the people who side with you to side even more, and the people who disagrees with you disagree even more. Now, the case of the straw manning is actually even more extreme, because in this case, we're not even attacking a person. We're talking about what we perceive that person to be. We don't even need a real person to attack. In this case, we create a caricature, and this is the definition of a straw man, of a person, meaning we create what we believe that person to be. We create a stereotype, and we attack the stereotype, not the person itself. Now, we tend to communicate better, and this is no secret, once we sympathize with the people that are listening to us. So obviously, if we're siding with the person and the person is listening to us, we tend to communicate better with that person. A common way to sympathize with our audience, especially if you have any sort of media presence, and if you are a person of certain powers, and by power I mean like you have a follower, so you have people who side with you. A common way to sympathize with your audience is to appeal to their feelings. Remember that our heuristics is there for a reason, and then it's just to detect things are good and things are bad for you. Now, as I said before, this is not a 50-50 system. It's not a balanced system. It's more uh, designed to focus more on the negative side than it is to focus on the positive side. So, unfortunately, negative feelings are more vital than positive ones. People are wired to avoid danger more than they are wired to look for happiness. We have discussed that, even to the point that if presented the opportunity, we will focus more on ways to prevent ourselves to find an animal that could kill us than we would to focus on getting food that can actually help us live a little bit longer. Now, not dying is more important than live a happy life from a survival point of view. That is the basics on why we're focusing more on the negative ones. Now, the more extreme a view is, the more attention you will get from people. So if I pick any subject in which you are very engaged, it's something that has to do with something that has to do with your passions. It could be politics or certain policies that you're very passionate about. It could be sports. So it doesn't matter if it is true or not. If someone says something outrageous that is negative, it immediately triggers that sense of unsafety. Like you don't feel safe, and then you immediately need to protect yourself. And we tend to do this again by what? Looking for ways to demonize that person or those people who are expressing those views, and immediately looking for people who will side with us so we can gather together and punish those people so we can protect ourselves and protect our behavior and return back to our normal safety or normal safe space. Now, we tend to exaggerate the other people's positions to appeal to people who sympathize with us much easier. Because again, if I just tell you something outrageous and I don't see so much reaction, if I address that in a different way and I add a little bit more and I give some more spices to what the person said, or maybe I link that to something else that that person said in the past and I put it together and now it's a concoction of negativity, you will react even more. So it is all to protect the in-group identity and ideas. As I said before, if I'm part of this group who believes differently from the group that I'm attacking, I'm going to look for people who side with me, and all of us are going to try to look for that because now we as a group feel that our beliefs are being attacked. Now, unfortunately, some people are not even aware of doing that. I would say, and I would argue that most people were not aware of that. And unfortunately, this is done 24/7 now. And this is just a new problem. This is a new phenomenon because we have so much access to information through our technology that obviously now we don't even have to wait anymore. We see these every single day. Now, the problem with that is that there's a new phenomenon attached to that, and that is the 24/7 bullying. And I will have a separate video just talking about bullying, but I wanted to introduce that idea here because I think it's relevant to the subject that we're covering. So imagine this, you're being criticized all the time. Imagine physically having someone in front of you talking bad things about you, how bad you have performed. You go to sleep, you wake up, you have another person talking negativity about how bad you're doing, how you're going to be even more criticized, that nobody likes you. So unfortunately, our brain doesn't make that distinction, or is not as efficient at making that distinction between having a person constantly in front of us saying those things than reading about that. Yes, having a person physically there has a higher impact because we're perceiving a person, we're seeing how that person is yelling at us, how the person, we can see the cues on their body language, we can see the cues even on the sound of their voices, on their words. But when we read something, especially when we read something so negative, we're constantly bombarded by that. As I was saying before, it's like we don't stop triggering our amygdala, and our amygdala is constantly saying, hey, you're in danger, you're in danger. Now, there's no a way to escape, or people to talk. Imagine that you don't have, again, a way to escape, or people to talk to, or friends that abandon you out of fear of being persecuted by the public as well. So unfortunately, that's something that we are constantly doing nowadays. I was saying before that we don't see the others as having the same problems. We don't think that we think that it's even unfair that they have so much money, that they are going to do fine, that the attacks that we're giving them, that they're going to not feel anything. We don't realize, again, we don't stop and think that maybe that person doesn't have the skills, doesn't have the knowledge, doesn't have people around them to compensate for that. And there are real consequences to that behavior. And one has to do with the obviously increase in unhappiness, depression, and suicide rates, especially among rich and famous. So I'm not saying, I'm not blaming you or the audience, but we're kind of participant in that culture. We're participant in that culture by not looking at things from a more measured point of view, but rather just acting out of our instincts. Now, what to do about the ad hominem attacks? Because yes, I've told you about what happens and what is it, but what can we do? So again, the ad hominem attacks being the attacks that we do of a person rather than attacking the arguments or attacking an idea. A common objective that I think most people can be behind would be to not accept any ad hominem attacks, especially when those attacks work in our favor. Now, you probably are saying, well, I believe that most people will not be okay with that, but I'm going to tell you why. Because if you don't do that, you're kind of opening the door for people to attack you when you have or said something inappropriate or something that they consider appropriate. You're opening the door to someone to do that to you. Now, I think that, as I said before, but I did it about the strawmanning, it doesn't even address any problem. You're not addressing a particular subject. You're not addressing what that person said itself. You're not attacking the belief. You're attacking that person's character. You're attacking that person for what they did. And I think that that is something that we have to be careful, because, again, we're not making things better. We're just making another person to feel even insecure or hate you more, which again doesn't bring anything good to the conversation. So again, I think that this is a rule that, and I will rarely say that, but this is a rule that should be strictly applied. Meaning, if you're in a conversation with someone and then someone is attacking someone else, especially someone that you both have a disagreement with, and then that person that you're talking to says about this other person bad things about that person's character, you can ask, how is that even relevant to what you're trying to say? Like, you were talking about how that person was awful because this is what he did. Why are you now attacking this other thing that has no relevance whatsoever? So just by asking those questions, obviously, you're not going to be very popular, but sometimes you will cut that conversation. It is important to cut the conversation early on, because you don't want to enter into a rant in which you're feeding each other by making yourself feeling even more angry about that person that you're attacking, because that, again, doesn't bring any good outcome. Now, the only exception in which I think ad hominem attacks should be a thing is those in which the person's character has a direct relevance and consequence to the thing being discussed. So obviously, if you're talking about someone who exhibits a racist behavior, that is definitely something that you should be concerned about and something that you should obviously talk, and then you should expose that. But other than that, it's not relevant to what you're being discussed. You shouldn't even mention, because again, it's not relevant to the conversation. Now, what to do about strawman attacks? Unfortunately, this is a little bit harder because most times we're not even aware of doing it. I've expressed that a million times about biases. Um, Most biases, we're not even aware that we are part of bias. That's actually one of the reasons why biases perpetuate, because we're not aware of them. And sometimes even when we're pointing out that we're being biased, people defend themselves. Remember that there are many mechanisms designed to solve and to protect yourself and to protect your beliefs. So being attacked or being accused of being biased is like saying that you're a bad person, and no one wants to admit that. So what are you going to do? Immediately look for a way to attack the person who's attacking you, and to look for security or safety by looking with for others that think like you, so you can gather together and attack that person. So we truly believe that we're attacking the person when we do strawmanning, but and not the caricature of the person. And that's actually one of the most dangerous problems that we encounter with the strawmanning, is that we believe that we're not attacking an exaggeration of the person. We're not attacking a stereotype. We're attacking the person. We tend to believe that, again, our heuristics and the truth are the same thing. Now, one solution would be to only accept arguments that can directly be seen or perceived. Something that you believe is not an argument. Something that you feel is not an argument. Something that is in your gut is not an argument. So you need to make a connection between reality and truth. And I was actually giving you an example on how racism can actually be obviously something that you should expose. But I'm going to give you an example on how sometimes racism can actually be um, or accusing someone of being racist can be poorly executed and incur in strawmanning. So a couple of months ago, when there was a mayoral race in New York City, Eric Adams, who's one of the leading um, politicians, was accusing Andrew Yang, who's another politician, of racism, because Andrew Yang has said that he, Eric Adams, was not living in New York City. Now, if you don't know, Andrew Yang is Asian and Eric Adams was black. So his response, the response of Eric Adams, was to accuse Andrew Yang of racism because of those comments, because Andrew Yang has said that he didn't live in New York City, and therefore he shouldn't qualify to become a mayor if he's not even living in New York City. Now, obviously, there's no connection between you saying that someone doesn't live in New York City and you're not qualified to be a mayor and race. Those are two separate, and there's objectively no connection with that. Despite not having any connection, he was accused of being racist, not only by him, but other people who sided with him and other journalists who side with Eric Adams by accusing Andrew Yang of being racist. So again, those are things that are objectively not true. Now, I'm not saying that he's not racist, and I'm not saying that he is racist. I'm just saying that there's no connection between those two things. And that is an important distinction, because even if you perceive that that person is racist, you have to make the case, and you have to make a good case, that there's a correlation between one and the other one. If you cannot do that, all you're doing is attacking a straw man. You're attacking that person. And worse is that that was used to, again, attack Andrew Yang as a racist person because he had made that comment. So you can see how something that is objectively not true can transform into something different. And then from that different, you now are attacking that difference, and you're creating that stereotype and attacking the stereotype. And the problem with all of this is that it's actually effective, especially, as I said before, for the people who side with Eric Adams. The perception of Andrew Yang is like, well, maybe he doesn't like black people. And that is something extremely dangerous because, again, as I said before, that is objectively not true. Now, I want to make that clear. That doesn't mean that all of the times that you cannot prove that someone is racist, that person is not racist. That just means that you haven't made that connection. That means that objectively that is not true. So the problem is, and this is how I'm going to leave you, is that this is about you and about your choices. You have the the power to choose if you want to behave in a manner that we can live a little bit better in society or not. So what I was telling you are ways in which you can actually try to avoid both. But at the end of the day, this is about you. You are the person who will determine if, when encountered to the same situation in the future, if someone is doing strawmanning and you think, well, you know what, I side with you. I see that you don't like that person and I don't like that person either. But what you're saying actually is not what that person is about. It is important for us, especially when we tend to side with the person who's doing that and we are demonizing someone else. We actually have to make that effort. We have to make sure that we are objective with what we say and not that we attack someone's character and something that has nothing to do with what we are discussing. And definitely that we're not attacking someone's caricature, that we're not attacking someone that doesn't even exist, that we're not attacking a stereotype. So as usual, I hope that this is useful. Excuse me. I know that this is a little bit longer, but I thought that this was a good way of me explaining how those biases are interacting with each other. And as I said before, we're going to dedicate each bias that we have mentioned that you have probably not seen yet, a particular video like the blind spot bias, the in-group bias. And again, I hope that you have enjoyed these. I hope that this is good, at least that it serves you to understand a little more on how biases interact. And thank you so much for watching this, and I see you in the next video. Thank you.